And then I'll get so excited about something that the excitement overwhelms me, and I just am in love with everything.
Well, I'm not a poet. I'm just a woman.
I want to go where culture is, like New York, or at least Connecticut or New Hampshire, where writers live in the woods.
Get into those schools anyway.
Do you ever wonder how, like, what story you're gonna be in somebody else's life? You ever think about that?
Ladybirds and gentlemen, nights and weekends, little women of all ages, and everyone else. Welcome to Glimpsing Greta, a Greta Gerwig movie podcast. I'm your host, Jay. I know I'm funny. I know everything about myself. That's why I can't do therapy. I know this isn't the episode we announced last week, but my co-host John's schedule got pretty busy, so I decided to go ahead and record the next episode of our bonus miniseries where I talk about the films of Greta Gerwig, who is the writer and director of the upcoming live-action Barbie movie. Of course, also just famous filmmaker in general. And today we're going to be talking about one of her sort of middle period films, at least thus far, 2015's Mistress America, which is directed by her partner Noah Baumbach and written by Baumbach and Gerwig. And yeah, it stars Lola Kirk, Greta Gerwig, Matthew Shear, Jasmine Cephas Jones, Heather Lind, Michael Chernus, Cindy Chung, and Dean Wareham, with other supporting cast members. And it premiered January 24th, 2015 at the Sundance International Film Festival and was acquired for distribution by Fox Searchlight actually before its premiere, so sort of on reputation alone. And then it was released in theaters on August 14, 2015, and subsequent Blu-ray release on December 1st. And yeah, as I mentioned, is directed by Noah Baumbach, and we have cinematography by Sam Levy, who you'll recognize that name if you listen to the episode on Frances Ha. He also did the cinematography there, and he also did the cinematography on Lady Bird, so we'll be talking about him again for that episode. And then we have music by Britta Phillips and Dean Wareham, and they are also frequent collaborators with Noah Baumbach. They did the soundtrack for The Squid and the Whale, and they actually did an original song for the recent film White Noise, which I talked about a bit on that episode. And they actually also both had small roles in several of his films, but they were in Frances Ha specifically. And Dean Wareham has a small but significant part in this film as well. And yeah, this movie was generally well received by critics, though the structure of it is a bit odd, and we'll talk a bit about it in the story section, but it's sort of, the first little portion is leading up to this big long sequence that takes up maybe 30-45 minutes of the movie, and then the last little bit is sort of wrapping up and figuring out sort of the fallout of that long sequence. And the big long sequence in the middle, divided opinion among critics. Some people appreciated its sort of screwball comedy sensibilities, while other people found it a bit clumsy. Well, you'll see what I thought about it soon enough. But yeah, this is the third Greta Gerwig film chronologically that we're talking about. And it's been 2 years since Frances Ha came out theatrically, and she started to kind of slow down her acting career. She only acts in 2 features, a TV movie, and a few shorts between Frances Ha and Mistress America. And then after Mistress America, she has very few film roles and mainly switches over to directing and writing. But she did in 2014 star in an off-Broadway production of The Village Bike, so she is still acting at this point. And Mistress America sees her re-teaming with her creative and romantic partner Noah Baumbach. This is the second feature they wrote together after Frances Ha, and the third feature they've worked together on. And they actually wrote the upcoming Barbie movie together, so sort of I'm interested to see how that plays out, because they have a very distinct style in Frances Ha and in Mistress America. But yeah, the story here is we follow Tracy, who's a freshman at Barnard College in Manhattan, and she is an aspiring writer, but she sort of fails to get into the prestigious literary club that the school has. So she befriends a fellow student, Tony, who also failed to make it into that club. And they initially seem to have romantic feelings for each other, but Tony starts dating a different girl named Nicolette. This kind of makes Tracy feel a bit lonely, but Tracy's mom is getting married, and the man she is marrying has a daughter who lives in New York. So on her mom suggested, Tracy reaches out to this woman, Brooke, and sort of meets up with her and starts hanging out with her as like a future sister-in-law. And even though there's a 12-year age difference between them, Tracy is 18 and Brooke is 30, they hit it off really well. And Brooke is sort of the free-spirited young woman who Greta Gerwig has played before in her career. She seems to have connections with everyone in the city. She has multiple jobs, and some aren't necessarily jobs that are more hobbies, and she's constantly having these ideas that she never really follows through on. Sort of a manic pixie dream girl of a sort, but in a way that the movie is going to be commenting on. Similar in ways to Frances Ha. But yeah, anyway, Tracy and Brooke spend the night together and have this great time, and Brooke's unique personality actually inspires Tracy to write a short story titled Mistress America. And the story is sort of wrestling with Brooke as she appears to others, and who's the real, who's under the surface behind this sort of bubbly personality. But obviously she doesn't show that to Brooke, and that ends up being a sore point in the story. But over the next few weeks, Tracy and Brooke spend a ton of time getting to know each other, and Tracy really looks up to Brooke, who is sort of the free-spirited, carefree, someone who moved to New York and is having this incredible time in the big city and living out her dreams. And meanwhile, I think there's this aspect where Brooke is kind of feeding off of Tracy's adoration. And so they become very close. And one night, Brooke, who she's been planning this big restaurant that she's going to open with her boyfriend, but she returns home one night to find her apartment is locked and her boyfriend has withdrawn all of his financial support from this restaurant. And so she only has a few days to come up with enough money to save the restaurant. Previously to this, she had sort of told Tracy about this old friend, Mamie Claire, who had, in Brooke's words, had stolen her cats, her fiance, and her idea for a t-shirt design. And now she lives with this man that she stole from Brooke up in Connecticut in this big fancy house. And so feeling sort of like she's at the end of her rope, there's no one else to go to, so Brooke is like, okay, fine, we can go and meet with Mamie Claire and her husband, who is named Dylan. And so Tracy enlists Tony to drive them to Connecticut, and Nicolette comes along sort of suspicious of why Tony and Tracy are hanging out together, so kind of keeping an eye on him. And the next section of the film takes place in real time over, like I said, I think it's like 30 to 45 minutes of just like what is going on in this big house as Brooke is trying to pitch her idea to Mamie Claire, who is uninterested, but they're sort of reopening different wounds that they gave each other during the course of their friendship. And we see the cats, and we hear about the t-shirt design, and turns out maybe there's more going on than what Brooke told Tracy. And then meanwhile, Tracy corners Tony and sort of tries to get him to admit that he has feelings for her and even kisses him. And Nicolette sees them and out of sort of jealousy steals short story Mistress America and locks herself in the bathroom to read it. While that's happening, Dylan returns home and Brooke is able to successfully pitch the idea of this restaurant to him, and he's going to give her the money. Tracy sort of has to help out with the pitch. But after that happens, Dylan actually takes Brooke aside and reveals that no, he wasn't actually convinced by the pitch. He is willing to give her money, but only enough to pay off her investors and rent out the space to someone else. And Brooke initially accepts this, though changes her mind when Tracy overhears and is like, no, actually, I'm going to stick to my principles here. And then Nicolette exits the restroom and sort of shows up and exposes how Tracy had used Brooke as the inspiration for her short story, where she sort of views Brooke as an aging sort of young person who never quite found herself and is, I think one of the phrases she uses is like dragging around the carcass of her youth. And everyone reads this short story and agrees that Tracy was a bit too harsh in her portrayal of Brooke. Turns into sort of this absurdist where Brooke is going to sue and anyway, like all of Tracy's friendships collapse in a minute. And then she goes outside and smokes some pot that I don't know. It's ambiguous who had it when. That would be something. There might be, if I rewatched it, some like thread going on of who has it when. But anyway, we cut forward a bit in time and Tracy is once again lonely at college. Turns out Brooke decided not to go ahead with the restaurant and sold off the property, and Tracy submits her story to the literary club, and it's good enough that she gets accepted, but she's lonelier than ever, and her mother visits to tell her that the engagement has been broken off, which Brooke already knew about that. She got the call during this whole big pitch meeting thing. But this means that her mom is now going to the Caribbean for Thanksgiving, so Tracy won't be able to return home. And sort of feeling that loneliness, Tracy decides to create her own literary club and invites Tony and Nicolette to apply and sort of repairs that relationship with Tony. And then on Thanksgiving, she visits Brooke's apartment. Brooke is in the process of moving out to go to LA, but she and Tracy reconcile and they go and have Thanksgiving dinner together at a restaurant. And in voiceover, Tracy muses that Brooke is, for all her faults, a beacon of hope for people around her. And that's sort of a very lonely thing to be. So yeah, one of the interesting things about this is it's kind of a Great Gatsby for millennials, in that the narrator is an outsider who moves to New York and finds themselves in the orbit of this sort of charismatic personality who's mysterious and everyone knows them, but no one knows them at the same time. And even though this person is initially dazzling, it is slowly revealed that they are actually a human being sort of putting on a performance and trying to be grander than they actually are. And then the story ends with the narrator concluding that, for all their faults, this charismatic person really is a good person, sort of maybe better than the people around them give them credit for. And yeah, like a lot of the films we've talked about for this series, there isn't really a traditional narrative structure here. It's sort of a collection of moments, and then one particular moment, this central scene at Mamie, Claire, and Dylan's house sort of dominates the story and is the thing that everything else revolves around. And it leads to a really interesting structure where you have the first little bit of the movie, which you set up the characters and their relationships, and then they go to this house and they just are set loose and they bounce off of each other, and there's chaos everywhere. There are 2 or 3 things going on at the same time in every moment, and you're kind of keeping track of who's talking to who, what are they saying, what does it mean, how does this change things for them. And then once that scene is done, it's sort of, now they have to pick up the pieces of what is left. What do they do with what happened? And I love this central scene because it's just so brilliantly constructed. It's chaotic and hilarious, and it captures what Brooke's life must feel like, where we're constantly bouncing between people and situations and ideas. Even in that, though, the pacing ebbs and flows, so it never gets stale. It's never like, it isn't just rushing through things. There are moments of quiet and calm, and then suddenly it becomes chaotic again. It feels like you're kind of in a house with a group of people and you're wandering between the rooms, and every once in a while you end up in the room where everything crazy is going on. And then sometimes you end up in the room where it's just, 2 people talking and trying to connect or play chess. Now, my one complaint about the scene and about the movie is the ending of this big sequence is the scene where everyone starts ganging up on Tracy and be like, no, this short story you wrote is terrible and Brooke should sue. And I don't know, it tips maybe a bit too far into absurdity. It feels like there could have been a better way of ending that scene, but at the same time, I understand you have to get Tracy to this place, to her low point, so that the rest of the movie can be sort of dealing with that and her having to confront the ways she's hurt the people around her. But yeah, overall the narrative is just really tightly constructed. Like, this is literally the same as some of the Barbie movies. It's an hour and 23 minutes, but it fits so much characterization and sort of these relationships into this small space. So yeah, I gave it a 4 out of 5 for the story. Next up, we have the characters, and there are a lot of really well realized characters here. And it starts with the 2 main characters, Tracy and Brooke. Tracy is the window through which we see the story, and her perceptions of the people around her are how we see them. So, we see Tony as this sort of awkward, oh, maybe he's cute, but is he interested in me? Why is he dating this other person? We see that relationship through her. We see Brooke through her eyes as well, where she's initially swept up in Brooke's life and wants to impress her as oh, she's my older sister who I didn't know I had. There's a scene where Brooke is like, hey, why don't you go buy pasta and meet me at my apartment? And so Brooke is or Tracy goes to the store and is desperately calling everyone she knows, what kind of pasta do I buy? It ends up with a shopping bag full of different types of pasta. But at the same time, she's still smart enough to see through a lot of Brooke's insecurities. And that short story she writes, even though it's mean, there is some truth behind it. And her arc is it starts out as, where you think it's going is, oh, she's sort of enamored with Brooke and her lifestyle, but she has to learn that Brooke's lifestyle isn't tenable. But instead, her arc is about having to learn that, oh no, her conceptions of who Brooke is, she's kind of reduced Brooke to something she isn't entirely. She has to learn to see Brooke as a person, not as a character in a short story. And that's interesting because Brooke herself is very evocative of the manic pixie dream girl trope, which is a common trope, especially around this time, of a female character, usually, who is just sort of bubbly and quirky and full of life. And, you know, in Brooke's case, she has a million jobs and knows everyone and loves going out to parties. And that's kind of like, as a trope, it is often sort of this male gaze trope of like how men see women as like specifically romantically. And usually the manic pixie dream girl exists as like a foil to a more cynical man who she has to like help lift out of depression. But here, the movie is sort of poking and prodding at this trope and at the sort of the real people that the trope is based around. And it's really asking, like, what happens to this manic pixie dream girl when she turns 30? And that's where Tracy's observations are a bit true, where, like, yeah, Brooke is starting to age out of the point where people will put up with her antics. And to a certain extent, like, Brooke is just sort of hilariously unself-aware. Like the quote I said at the top of, I know I'm funny, I know everything about myself, that's why I can't do therapy. That's sort of like a funny way of showing her sort of limitations as a person, of like, she doesn't really know herself, but she thinks she does. And there's this line she keeps repeating of like, that's just not how I was raised. And it'll be in just sometimes the most random moments. But it is her sort of philosophy of life of like, oh, that's not what I'm like. Even if, like, one of the most interesting scenes in the movie is in the first sort of segment where we're learning about the characters. And so first off, Brooke remembers every harm that everyone in her life has done to her. Specifically, Mamie Claire. We hear a lot about, you know, oh, she did this, she did that, she stole my cats and my fiance and my t-shirt idea. And yet, there's this scene where she stumbles across an old friend from high school, and initially they're like amicable, they're chatting, and then the old friend from high school is like, oh, by the way, I never got an apology for how you bullied me in high school. And Brooke suddenly gets sort of like very defensive of like, oh, I don't remember that in high school. It never had an effect on me. Why are you bringing this up? And then like even going so far as almost like say like, you deserved it. Like, if I bullied you, it's because you deserve to be bullied. And the way she remembers everything that everyone has done to hurt her, but dismisses the way she's hurt everyone else, it's fascinating as like a commentary on this trope, and also the people who are not the people who are similar to the trope, but the way, you know, there are people who go through life as like thinking that they're the main character. And what this movie does is it flips that on her head, where it's like, Brooke isn't the main character. We're seeing her through Tracy's eyes. But at the same time, Tracy has a lot of those same tendencies. And so Brooke has to grow, but so does Tracy. And yeah, that's just so much, such an interesting character arc to have for your two main characters. And even when it's sort of like exposing these characters for who they are, there's still a lot of empathy there, where we're asked to be like, okay, these are flawed protagonists, but we aren't supposed to see them just for their flaws. You know, even though Brooke is sort of unaware and holds these grudges against people, but then dismisses the harm she does, like, even though those things are true, we're still invited to empathize with her and see things how she sees them. And then also see things how everyone else in the film sees them. So it's what I liked about Frances Ha as well, where it's empathetic towards every character in the story to some degree. There's no clear villain or anything. And I think one of the characters who kind of embodies this paradox is Tony. He's kind of like a classic Noah Baumbach guy. I've started to recognize this character in several of his movies, where it's like he rides the line between being like a sweetheart and an ignorant doofus, and exists as sort of this paradox where it's like he's probably a genuinely nice guy. There's a scene where he is, when they arrive at Mamie Claire's house, she's doing this sort of book club for pregnant women, and they're reading like these big heavy philosophical texts, and Tony is just like, holy shit, these pregnant women are super smart. And he just like goes and is like fascinated by these conversations they're having. It is like genuinely interested and engaging, and he learns about these different women and makes this sort of connection with one of them, who's Karen, who ends up being a part of this whole sequence of events despite not really having any relationship to anything in it. But yeah, he's just like he's willing to do things for Tracy and like look out for her and be her friend, but he's also like dating someone else and knows that in doing that he's making her jealous. And that's kind of the paradox, is he like, how much does he understand what he's doing in his own actions, and how he's both helping and hurting the people around him. And there's a line he has of like, I thought I was in touch with my feminine side, but right now I don't understand how, in this scene it's Nicolette, why is Nicolette acting like this? And that's a very revealing line for his character, where he's like, he wants to be that sort of supportive person who, and an understanding person, but there's just like a barrier that he can't quite get over. But I did end up feeling for him. He's a doofus and a sweetheart at the same time. And yeah, next up we have Nicolette, who, of the sort of central four characters, she's the one that we get to know the least. She's very understandably upset with Tony and Tracy, of sort of like the way Tony is constantly doing, like, oh yeah, Tracy, I'll take you to Connecticut, I'll drive you there. Like that's a bit, even if his intentions are entirely friendly and not romantic, which I think there is some ambiguity there, but even if they were, like that's just an odd thing to do. I think we again are seeing Nicolette through Tracy's eyes, and so she comes off as a bit neurotic and jealous, but we don't get much of a sense for what she is like when Tracy isn't around. And based on Tony's sort of relationship with her, I think it's safe to say that like she's generally a very chill person, and it's just that like Tracy is bringing out sort of the worst side of her. And yeah, next up we have Mamie Claire, who, when you first meet So at the start of the movie, when Brooke is describing her and she's like, oh yeah, maybe Claire, she stole all of these things from me. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, okay, at some point we're going to meet her and she's going to be nicer than this portrait that Brooke paints. And that's kind of how you feel when you first meet her. She seems nice. She seems a little bit exasperated by Brooke. She even sort of talks about how the t-shirt idea that she quote unquote stole, that was actually, she set up a meeting and invited Brooke along, and it was both of their ideas, and Brooke didn't show up. And so Mamie Claire was just like, okay, fine, I'll just go ahead with this idea, because obviously Brooke doesn't want to. And then Brooke sort of interpreted that as like, she stole my idea. But then there's this moment where after you've met Mamie Claire, she's kind of been like pushing Brooke's buttons. She just admits that she likes getting Brooke mad and is like, oh, it's so easy to get you mad. That's why I do that. That's why I'm pushing your buttons here. But then she's still revealing sort of these situations are more complex in the way Brooke described them. Like the cats. Why did she take the cats? Well, she paid for surgeries for the cats that Brooke didn't pay for. So she was like, okay, well, if I'm going to pay for these surgeries, these are now going to be my cats. And then there is also like a sadness to this character where we see her desperately trying to cling to this relationship with Dylan, and she's losing her grasp on it. And it's funny in sort of how we see her clinging to Dylan, and there's a scene where Dylan like grabs Brooke's hand, and in context it makes sense as like, oh, a congratulatory, like here, and then maybe Claire like runs up and grabs Dylan's other hand. I was like, no, you're still mine. But it is also sad to see like, oh, this is a relationship that's on the outs, and she's trying her best to hold on to it. But then at the same time, she and Dylan like can't help but push each other's buttons. I don't know. It's a complex relationship dynamic that is, I mean, they're on screen for 30 minutes of the movie, and yet you get the sense of a full lived in relationship. And Dylan himself, he's kind of an asshole. Like, he is constantly pushing Mamie Claire's buttons, and I think that's part of the reason he humors Brooke, is to like get on Mamie Claire's nerves. But he is still more complex than he seems at first, because at first you think, oh, he's a bit of a sort of naive, he buys this whole pitch hook, line, and sinker. But then he reveals that he's like, oh no, I'm doing this to be nice to Brooke. I don't actually believe in her pitch. I don't think it has a future. So I'm just gonna like give her enough to get out of this situation and leave. But he doesn't actually like believe in the idea. And it's an interesting thing, because a lot of this movie is like flipping the idea of who you think these characters are going to be and who they actually are. And yeah, the last character I wanted to talk about, she doesn't have as big a role in the story, but Karen, she's one of the pregnant women who's at the book club, and once the book club is over, everyone's leaving, and Karen's just kind of like, oh yeah, I'm waiting for my husband. He'll be here anytime now. And then obviously doesn't show up. So she spends the next 45 minutes running around the house with everyone following the chaos and occasionally pitching in. And she'll just be like sometimes in the background of a shot, or it's just, she ends up wrapped in a story that has nothing to do with her in a way that I find very funny and sort of contributing to that screwball comedy of that central sequence. And then eventually it's like when everyone reads the short story, she's the lawyer who's gonna help Brooke sue. So I think it's kind of just a fun character to have in the background here. And there is also in the central sequence, we keep seeing the housekeeper for Mamie, Claire, and Dylan, who's just like, will wander into a scene and then wander out. And you would almost miss her. But sort of that acknowledgement of like, oh, there's this underclass here that is like there to serve everyone. I don't know, it's a layer of complexity that the movie is sort of acknowledging but not diving into. But yeah, with all of these characters, I find them fascinating, and I think Gerwig and Baumbach both have a very good grasp on writing interesting characters, and I think Gerwig in particular is great at like finding the empathy. So yeah, I gave the characters a 5 out of 5. Just incredible all around, well realized characters. Now, next up we have the visuals, and here's where I'm gonna maybe praise this movie a little less. There's an ugly filter over everything that just makes everything look bad. It's like an orangey filter. It's not good. It's not like, this isn't a movie that needs the visuals to work. So it's not something that makes the movie terrible. It's just kind of like a disappointing thing. But besides that, I think the visuals are mostly good. The compositions aren't nearly as like closely considered as they were in Frances Ha, but the blocking and the spatial geography in this central sequence where they're walking around this big house, like, it's spectacular the way it's so dynamic, and there's a bunch of rooms in play, and you have like a general idea of where all of these rooms are, and there's like more and more rooms the deeper in the sequence you get. I don't know if they revisit any room. I think they're just kind of like, well, here's one room, and here's another room, and there's another room, and there's another room, and they're just kind of walking in this big circle, but they never double back. So yeah, that, in that way, the visuals were great, and the house they found was incredible for this. But again, that orange filter, I have to give the visuals a 3.5 out of 5. So next up we have the performances. Lola Kirke plays Tracy, and she's just a standout performance here. She captures a spirit that reminded me of some of those early Greta Gerwig performances, to the extent of like the first 10 minutes or so of this movie is all Tracy, and I was like, where is Greta Gerwig? Is that Greta Gerwig? Like, she's embodying that sort of spirit, which is interesting given the character she's playing. Yeah, Gerwig herself, she's playing this to the back seats. She's very broad and overwrought, and it kind of works given the character she's playing, but I did feel like some of her line deliveries were maybe a bit oversold. But I mean, that is sort of the character she's playing here, so I can't really fault her for that. Matthew Shear plays Tony, and I just, he's a real cutie. He plays the role very well, and he rides that line of like, is he like ignorant? Is he aware? Is he pushing people's buttons? What is he doing? But he still ends up feeling like a real sweetheart here. Heather Lind, she plays Mamie Claire, and she just has this incredible energy where, like, when she appears on screen and her dynamic with Gerwig, there's like great chemistry between them that just adds that extra jolt of energy throughout this whole big expansive sequence. Michael Chernus plays Dylan, and he's hilarious. He's playing this character with layers, and he really lets you think the character is more naive than he actually is. So that reveal of like, when he reveals, oh no, I didn't buy into the pitch, like, that moment hits so much harder because you believe him up until at that point that he's played this sort of like big, maybe a bit naive, rich guy. And then he reveals that, no, he is stone cold. Then we have Jasmine Cephas Jones. She plays Nicolette. Again, she doesn't get a ton to do, but I think she does a really good job with what she has. She really shines through with a character who's maybe a little bit underwritten, or I guess just a character who doesn't do much. And then Cindy Chung plays Karen, and she gets some of the best line readings in the movie, and she's allowed to be sort of like a more of the absurdist comedic relief in this sort of big expansive sequence. So I thought she did a fantastic job with, again, what's a pretty small role. And I think all of the performances are at their best in this central set piece where everyone gets to bounce off of each other and there's like chemistry and the lines are moving fast and everything has this sort of like rhythm to it. So yeah, I gave the performances a 4 out of 5. And then finally the music, this is a pretty solid score. It has like a uniquely digital feel to it, which sort of places it in the time of like 2015. I don't think it's anything to write home about, but it works for what the movie needs. So I give it a 4 out of 5. And that leaves my final score as a 4.2, my final score as a 21 out of 25, which is a 4.2 on a 5-point scale, or an 84%. That puts it sort of just slightly behind White Noise in terms of my rankings for these Greta Gerwig movies so far. It's great. I really enjoyed it. I think it is worth seeking out, especially if you're a fan of Gerwig and Baumbach and the way they write dialogue and characters. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Make sure to follow us on social media. We are Binging Barbie Podcast on Instagram, at Binging Barbie on Twitter, and Binging Barbie, a Barbie movie podcast on Letterboxd. There you can find an up-to-date list of all of our rankings, both for Barbie movies and for the Greta Gerwig movies. And we will be back next week with our regular schedule of Barbie movies with Barbie Princess Power. See you then.